Hello, humans. About a month ago, Dael Kingsmill made a video where she talked about a bunch of D&D house rules she wanted to steal, and one of my house rules was in that video.
And number 6, this one's quite fun, Coyote Time, which I picked up from Trikairos on YouTube.
So I thought, let's make a video with my top 5 homebrew D&D rules. These are all house rules I've had for multiple years at this point. They're all battle tested and have stood the test of time. And to my knowledge at least, they're all unique. Meaning in this video, I am not going to talk about rules I stole from other people, like flanking being a +2 to hit. You can still use those popular house rules. I think they're cool, I use them too, but I want to give you some fresh, new, homemade food. Maybe make you discover stuff you haven't tasted before. So let's start with the first one. If you're a dungeon master, how do you use passive perception in your games? According to a poll I've run on my channel, about half of you don't use it at all, either because you forget that it exists or because you don't like it. And for a while, I was right there with you. I didn't like the idea of letting players auto-succeed on their rolls for 2 reasons. One, there's an 11th level rogue feature called Reliable Talent. That makes it so when you roll 9 or lower on the d20 for a check where you have proficiency, you can change the result on the d20 to a 10, which is basically the exact same thing as using that player's passive score. So in every game where I have a rogue, which is to say every game because my players are edgy edgelords, it feels like if I use passive perception, it takes away from one of the few things that make the rogue player feel cool. It's kind of like letting a player roll stealth to cast a spell silently, while the sorcerer, who had to pay an opportunity cost and spend some resources to get access to subtle spell meta magic, is staring at you like, what are you doing? This is my thing. And the second reason I don't like passive checks as written is rolling dice is fun. So any mechanic that tells me to roll less dice is instantly going to make me and my players raise one giant collective eyebrow. So here's how I fixed it. If a player's passive score beats the DC of a check I have in my GM notes, all that happens is that I tell the player there is a check they can attempt, but they can still fail, and if they do, it will be fun, because if a check made it to my GM notes, almost by definition, it means I had time to come up with some interesting consequences for failure. But the important aspect is that it still encourages players to take initiatives. With auto successes, players can often rely on having a high passive and use that instead of making rolls. But if I keep teasing my players every week about that one DC 25 secret that they missed because they didn't ask the right questions, they're going to start asking more questions. And 99% of the time, they're going to ask about things I don't have a DC written down for, but that's a good thing as far as I'm concerned. It means those players are being proactive, making rolls, interacting with the scene. Number 2. At my table, the improvise action is a bonus action. Now, if you're unfamiliar, which is understandable because this is probably the least popular action in D&D, the improvise action basically refers to any ability check you make during combat, except for a few of them, like hiding, for example, which have their own dedicated action. To me, this action is what makes tabletop RPGs special. It's the one thing that keeps me coming back to these games when I could be playing Helldivers instead. Even Baldur's Gate 3, a game that tried to create the video game equivalent of D&D, and that has been praised for how it lets players think outside the box, could not quite figure out how to have an improvise action. But there is one problem with the improvise action, the fact that it is an action. So as much as I, as a GM, want my players to use it and know that if they do, it's usually going to result in the most fun and memorable moment of that night, most of the time the players opt not to use it because they only have one action, and the super fun improvising is competing for that one action with the super reliable attacking or casting a spell depending. And players are simple, boring creatures. If you give them a choice between fun and reliable, a lot of them will choose reliable. So let's not give them a choice. Let's make it so they can do both in a single turn. And the way we do that is simple. We just make the improvise action a bonus action. And now it's not competing for the same resource anymore, which means your players get to use it way more often. Now, some classes will still give the players things to do as a bonus action. The sorcerer can quicken a spell, the barbarian can rage, etc. But the cool thing is that most bonus actions in D&D are tied to a limited resource, which means your players are not going to use those every single turn. They're still going to have turns where they will go, I have nothing better to do, so I guess I'll try something fun. Except for monks. but they chose to play a monk, so they kinda deserve not to have fun. Number 3. Spellcasting languages. At my table, spells are always cast in one specific language, which depends on two things: the origin of the magic that's being used, so arcane, natural or divine, and its alignment, good, neutral or evil. So let's say you see a fiend casting a spell, for example. That's evil divine magic, so they're going to be casting it in abyssal or infernal. Why does that matter? It matters for counterspells. The problem with counterspell is that normally you don't know what spell someone else is casting, so the players don't know whether they're trying to counterspell a 1st level Witch Bolt or a 9th level Power Word Demonetize. And that tends to result in feel bad moments, where the players feel like they're wasting a spell on something useless or inconsequential. To help with that, a lot of GMs will try to give their players hints about the level of the spell or the school of magic the spell is from, by saying things like, the Lich's fingers start glowing with green necromantic energy. What do? But even with that, you still get the occasional feel-bad moment. So by introducing the concept of a spellcasting language, you completely remove the ambiguity if the player does actually understand the language the spell is being cast in. It pays off their character creation choices and their backstory in a way that is very flavorful, and in the case where they don't understand the language, there's a spell for that. The players just need to spend an extra resource to use it. Plus, this house rule allows for some juicy plot twists. For example, let's say your players meet with a high priest to ask for a blessing. The priest starts chanting an incantation in Draconic, a language used to cast arcane spells, not divine spells. And moments later, a wound opens in reality and something dreadful crawls out, its form hideous to behold. Now, I would say that's a pretty cool plot twist. But I've got a second one for you, which is that this super crisp description I just did, that's something I found on dScryb, which is the sponsor of today's video. dScryb is a website with over 15,000 descriptions put together by professional writers who've worked at Paizo and Wizards of the Coast, among others. It's kind of like having boxed text, but for your homebrew adventures. But where I find dScryb super powerful is that it can give you some inspiration too. Like, let's say you're preparing a goblin dungeon, so you type goblin in the search bar, and you get exactly what you're looking for. But you also stumble upon a description for a goblin infant, which is something you didn't know you were looking for, but then you read it and it describes how the goblin kid stands shakily, then falls, the weight of its large head carrying it to the ground. A shrill cry follows, and mucus pours from the poor thing's bulbous nose. That is the most adorable thing you've ever heard, so now your adventure has a goblin kid in it. So if, like me, you want to have your adventures completely derailed by finding some random descriptions that you end up falling in love with, you can use the promo code to get a 30-day free trial. There's a link in the description down below. But now, back to homebrew rules. Number 4. All movement, forced or not, does provoke opportunity attacks, except from the creature who caused it. So let's say you're in this situation where 2 of your allies are in melee with a big monster, and you cast Thunder Wave to push the monster 15 feet away. This house rule just increases the amount of opportunities your players get to do cool things together. It is very powerful, and it's probably going to mess with your game's balance a bit if you use it, but that's nothing you can't fix by just throwing more or more powerful monsters at your players. And last, but definitely not least, let's talk about the house rule that got this whole video started. Coyote Time. That one YouTube short got over 2,000 comments, so I thought let's do a director's cut version of it, where I addressed things I couldn't at the time because shorts had a maximum duration of 1 minute. The rules for falling suck in D&D. You just instantly fall 500 feet, which means even if you can fly, you get separated from your party and it's going to take you multiple rounds to make it back to where the action is. So a lot of people corrected me about the 500 feet figure, using real-life physics to calculate exactly how many feet you would fall in 6 seconds starting from a speed of 0. And thank you for the free engagement. Please make sure you tell me all of the reasons my house rules suck in the comments below, and I love you all for being such absolute nerds. But the speed of the fall isn't the problem that I'm talking about, and my house rule doesn't actually change it. The problem is that the fall is instantaneous, meaning there is no room for the players to respond to it. That is what the house rule changes. I don't care about the realism. What I care about is player agency. And because of that, many dungeon masters avoid running encounters near cliffs, even though they would be super cinematic. So let's fix that. Introducing my favorite house rule, Coyote Time. Whenever a creature would fall 10 feet or more, instead of falling instantly, the creature can choose to delay its fall until the end of its next turn, or current turn, whichever comes first. So the way I worded that rule wasn't super clear, especially the whichever comes first part. The idea is that if you start falling during your own turn, typically because you jumped, your fall happens at the end of that turn, and that lets you do some cool mid-air action movie stuff, but not game the system by delaying your fall forever. But if you start falling during someone else's turn, typically because they pushed you off a cliff, you won't actually fall until the end of your next turn. And that means you are guaranteed to have at least one chance to save yourself. Basically, in either scenario, when your turn ends, you fall. This gives the players a chance to react before the point of no return. And since falling is the kind of problem you can't punch, the players pretty much always have to get creative. For example, one time I had a zombie kraken fling the sorcerer into the river Styx. The sorcerer then cast a cone of cold to freeze the surface and landed on it. This last part of the video got a lot of comments about how the cone of cold spell doesn't mention it freezes the surface of liquids. If this was your comment, I'm sorry. I know I'm supposed to be saying there's no wrong way to play D&D to be a good little YouTuber, but you could be having so much more fun with this game. And that's it for today's video. Let me know your favorite house rules down in the comments. Okay, bye.